We're ready, sir.
All right. So guys, today we're gonna talk about the early stages of cannabis development, kind of a broad overview of the cloning process and the vegetative, and get into some of the flowering stuff, later. Basically what we're doing here is cloning cannabis. Cannabis and hemp, we clone it to achieve a new plant with a particular characteristic. That might be some growing activities, how you grow it. Some plants like hydroponic growth better than they like being planted into the ground. Some plants have characteristics to atmospheric conditions. Some plants like cold, some plants like a little bit more heat. Some plants are more resistant to bugs or have certain colors that we really desire. So whenever we clone a plant, what we're looking to do is to retain that characteristic of the plant. The idea is through cloning, we can get better individuals, that we can maintain those. Now sometimes what we can do is get better individual plants if we cross two plants that have two different characteristics. For example, if we have a plant that is bug and pest resistant with a plant that really likes the cold weather, we can breed those two and we can get the best of both worlds, and we can take cuts from clones and we can duplicate those plants as well. There's also an asexual reproduction, which is basically getting one plant to produce within itself, whether that be through cloning, through hermaphroditing the plant, or through crossing a male and a female of the same species of plant. We can get that plant to produce seeds and maintain that genetic line. Artificial cloning is defined as the reproduction of a plant starting from a cell, a tissue, or an organ such as a root, a stem, or a branch. In theory, any plant can be cloned with the correct light, temperature, nutrients, and health. So some of the characteristics of asexual reproduction. Many of the cells of mature plants contain tissues that can retain potential to multiply, differentiate, and give rise to different structures such as stems and roots. Within those cells, to multiply, that can be found in just about any organ of any plant. This type of propagation creates identical reproduction of a plant's productivity or its quality, its tolerance to stress, and whatnot. Sometimes we're looking for hemp that doesn't produce a lot of seeds, doesn't produce any seeds, and so sometimes through that asexual reproduction we can try and get plants that'll give us, again, those certain characteristics. Forms of asexual reproduction could be something like grafting a plant, which is you take a branch from one plant, put it on another plant, and those plants will fuse together. Or we can take a cutting of a plant, a branch, and actually get that plant to form roots onto it.
What is the binding agent that you use whenever you're trying to strip this plant together? You just kind of like
No, there's a glue. There's like a gel or a glue, a paste that you put in between the stalk of the main plant and the branch, put them together, tape them together, and they'll fuse together and start.
So you can't use like green stuff?
Yep, absolutely.
What's the difference between taking the branch and making it get roots between cloning?
Cloning is just that. You're taking a cutting and making it root. That's a clone. You can also take what we're talking about here is taking a branch, cutting it off of a plant, and attaching it to another plant so that that branch will continue to grow. You can save genetics if you're having a problem getting a branch to root. So grafting is what that is.
Question about grafting.
Yep.
When you do graft, let's just say you graft the diesel into a cartilage, the diesel is going to stay diesel, right?
Yep.
So they don't grow on the same plant, but it's going to be
Exactly. My dad was a farmer and grew citrus when we were young, and it was neat because he used to take apple trees and put it on a citrus tree, and that one citrus tree would have apple fruits and orange fruits on there. And so again, they're using the taproot. The apple would be using the taproot of the orange tree to maintain its life,
Right.
but you
But it
still
still
got.
keep its own life though.
Yep, exactly.
Okay, that's cool.
So something you can think about, and then there's some advanced forms of that as well. People are taking, like a clone. Maybe you've got a clone that's 20 years old. You really like it a whole lot, but you don't have that original plant. What people will do, because of the importance of a taproot, it can be gone into, if you study it a little bit more, they'll actually top a different plant and graft your clone onto a plant that has a taproot, so you can get a new, bigger plant, much larger plant. So people are doing that as well with grafting. Types of stakes. I've been kind of unfamiliar with this word stakes right here, so I'm gonna replace that with the word cutting. I think, I don't know. Cuttings are a part of a plant that's removed from a mother plant. These cuttings can be placed in a rooting bed to achieve the emission of their roots. Once they are rooted, they will become a new plant. Almost all plants, or all cuttings, are made from a plant in vegetative stage. There are some big downsides to taking a cutting from a plant that is flowering. So typically you want to do that whenever it's in its vegetative state. You can take a cutting of a stem of a plant, and then you can place that plant in a rooting gel, and then you put it in some kind of a soil or rock wool or whatever you may choose to put it in, and that will turn into its own plant. And some plants, you can take a cutting, or you can reproduce a plant from its leaf. Cactus is kind of one of those things. You can take a cactus leaf, keep it wet, stick it in the dirt, and the leaf itself will actually produce roots. There's also violets and some different type of peppermint plants will do that as well. They produce the roots off of the leaves, not off the stalk of the plant. And then there's also the replication of a root, which I've never done before. I'm sure there are some plants that you can clone the root. Typically propagation again by cutting a piece of a branch, which would be like this section right here of a stem, cutting that off and turning that into its own clone. Is probably the most common way of doing it. They're fragments of the plants with a reproductive purpose. Stem fragments can be cut and introduced into soil to produce a root. It's identical to its mother. So that's really important. It's identical to its mother. And you're going to get the same characteristics off the plant that you've been getting off of that plant. But also if that plant has any diseases, or has had any bug problems, it's suffering. Whenever you take a clone of a plant, you take those problems with it as well. You're not restarting the genetics. So the healthier the plant that you clone, it's definitely more ideal.
So we use that secondary piece for testing purposes to see how you may work with another one to see how,
So whenever I build up a garden, a large garden, I typically have 50 to 100 mother plants sitting in one room that I'm doing my very best every single day to make sure that they are as healthy as possible. And I'll come in and I'll take cuts of each plant and use that to put into production, which means they're gonna go through their vegetative life, they're gonna go through the flowering process. Meanwhile, this plant right here stays its whole life in a vegetative growth. And so this right here is, again, where I'm getting all of my flowers from.
what's the lifespan of, I guess, long as you got roots?
As long as you keep it healthy. There are some pets that have been around for a really long time. I think the average is probably about a year before people really start to see big problems, but there are plants that have been around for, a lot longer.
Is there any thing that we can do to save ourselves headache, like any major do's and don'ts when it comes to trimming? Or not trimming, but the cuts? Is that really, if we just go and cut them, we may run into the potential problems, just being kind of.
Well, I think plants have the ability, if you were to take a clean cut of a plant and stick it in water, that was pH the right way, and it was in a perfect environment, the plant, without doing anything else, could root. There are techniques such as taking the base of your cutting down towards the bottom area and shaving some of that bark off really delicately and giving the plant a porous area so that it can produce those roots a little bit easier without having to push through the bark is a good way. I think also cutting the bottom of the plant at a 45-degree angle and creating a point so that it stabs really well as you stab it into the soil or you push it through your rock wool is a really good tip as well. Oftentimes what we'll do as well is after we have shaved the bottom of the plant and we have cut it into a 45-degree angle, I'll also take a really nice razor and I'll split the bottom portion of that stalk as well and open it up so there's more area for roots. Yes, there's more areas for roots to come out of. There's a lot of techniques to cloning, and again, I'd recommend for everybody to just experiment with it and find what works for them. What I've noticed is if you shave too much of that stalk off, the plant becomes weaker, and it's also more susceptible to mold. So if your conditions aren't right, it doesn't have that protective layer of bark right there to fight that off. Also, if you stick a plant into a rock wool cube or something else, and the stalk itself bends, it breaks inside, that plant probably won't root.
So someone online said I've had cutting roots and just water before. Just simple.
Yeah.
There's also more chance of the bottom of your clone rotting if you do a lot of shaving and cutting.
Yes, exactly. So the person online just kind of reiterated that they've had plants that have rooted and nothing else but tap water. They've stuck the plant, just a cutting of a plant in tap water and it's kicked off roots. And she said that if you do excessive shaving of the plant, that it is more susceptible to mold and stuff as well. So again, there's techniques to doing it. You can experiment and kind of find your own way, but you can get away with just sticking a plant straight into some water, giving it the right temperature, the right conditions, pH and all, and that plant could potentially kick out roots. Yes, sir.
Have you ever seen total regeneration? Like, after harvest?
What do you mean?
Like, let's just say we got 2 plants, and we cut them off at the stalk, and they regrow.
Yes, I have. I've seen, not if I cut it down here to the very
Not
bottom,
2 though, yeah.
I've not seen that. But after harvest, if I cut all this plant back and I leave one leaf and one new nodal site, that plant will come back. I've accidentally put an award-winning mother into flower, into production, without knowing it. And as it starts to produce, I'm like, holy crap, I've lost this plant. Because I don't have any more clones of it, I don't have any replacements of it, I have to save that plant. But we're so far into flowering stage, the only thing I can do is flower this thing out, cut it all off, like I said, leave one stem, one leaf, one nodal site, and let that plant come back. It's super stressful on the plant, and that leaves room for a lot of problems. And as I've said, whenever we're doing this, we want to maintain those mothers as healthy as possible while we do whatever we're going to do with all of our cuttings and our clones. Because once the health of this mother starts to diminish, everything else that comes after that will be a diminished quality as well.
Excuse me.
Yes, sir.
I mean, obviously you're doing stuff with the clones to make them grow optimally. I don't know if you call it stressing them or whatever. I would assume stress is not the right word. So what is it that you're doing to the mothers that is so different? Or is it just, you're just saying you're just segregating them?
Not sure I understand the question. What makes this mother right here produce more clones?
No, you kind of talked about having them separate and
And making sure
taking
they
so
stay
much
healthy.
care of this one.
Uh-huh.
Whereas, I understand the idea that you're producing in the different vegetative flowering stages of whatever, but I assume that the care is similar,
I mean,
depending on just the
This is
stage.
where my money is right here. And so this is mega important. We're taking super care of these. But,
Oh, man.
this is the start of the money, so if I don't have this mother, then we don't have these right down here, and it takes so long to restart those, we're just extra vigilant on, for example, a mother room. I'm not letting anybody except for our nursery guy go in this room with his mothers. Anybody that's been working out in the field and has been in contact with all these other production plants can never come in and see my mothers. And kind of the same way, like I typically don't let people go in and out of rooms anyway. You know, there's just stuff that you can bring that you might not know about. There are different things that we can put in a mother environment that might last longer than we want it to. So we're not gonna spray some of our cuttings and some of our production plants with maybe some of the same things that we would do in our mother room. There's just kind of a different protocol for the way we handle the things. But again, the idea is that these always stay healthy. We do take a whole lot of care of our stuff, it's in production, but it's just kind of a different kind of care. Does that explain it?
Are the donors, the moms, are that sensitive? Or is it just like that you can pick up pollen from some of the other ones?
I'm more worried about bugs and diseases and that thing. We have typically, by the time we've got a mother, I mean, a mother's never going to produce the pistils or the ability to produce seeds. Unless we put that into a flowering room. So I'm not nearly as worried about pollen touching this plant, it wouldn't do anything, as I would be getting it infected with, a powdery mildew or something that we've got to battle really hard with to fight it off. A broad mite or a spider mite or something else that's now gonna damage the integrity of that.
Can you clarify,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
can you clarify on stresses, they're bad always, and what are some of the stresses?
Well, if you get an infestation of bugs on a plant, it can damage a plant considerably. Broad mites, spider mites, they eat the plant in a way that really hinders the plant's performance. That's a negative stress that you don't want to breed. A positive stress to a plant that you might want to do would be to actually pinch this stalk right here and create maybe an artificial deficiency here that causes the plant to send nutrients to that site and heal that plant, and that kind of stress will make a plant grow faster. Also, what we can do is I can stress the plant and I can cut this off right here, whether I'm gonna clone it or not. That plant is not gonna grow vertically anymore. That plant now has to heal itself here, and the way that it keeps growing is it will produce lateral growth. So that's another good type of stress that you can add to the plant that helps with the performance. But what we really want to stay away from is the negative stresses. If your plant is consistently in a really cold environment, the plant will wither up, it'll slow down its overall growth. If a plant is too humid, it'll start to produce powdery mildew. Powdery mildew becomes a systemic problem in the plant, and it's really hard to fight. And then again, bugs and whatnot. Oh, well, hold that, she's been waiting for a
No,
second.
I mean, I was just wondering, like, what's another type of herb or something that's kind of like used or cultivated the same way like cannabis is, like just legal, like, what is
Mangoes.
work?
I mean, you can.
I mean, I know like just any fruit, vegetable you grow, but all of them, I mean, I don't know the science behind it, but all of them you cut it off and,
Yeah, typically, I mean, the general
the
practices
same way you
would,
do an ivory, right? You take a
Yeah.
piece of, okay, so it's the same, all right,
Yep.
that's not about ivory.
yep, exactly.
With the flowering and the way that cannabis is there a way, I guess, to utilize it with more than just, cause I'm gonna rephrase your question, sorry, close down. Whenever you're clipping, I guess, cannabis, does it affect the different levels of cannabinoids within it? Because we've been reading on the method that is most beneficial for THC and CBD, essentially. But we're also learning about the 116 other ones. And some of the instructions, I guess, or how you're growing it affects like the THCV levels versus the THCA. So is the method that you're teaching us, I guess my question, the most efficient to grow THC and CBD based buds versus the other ones?
I don't think it matters.
They're all just, it's based off environment and then like, what else?
In my experience, as long as you cut and you manipulate this plant in a vegetative state,
Okay,
you're always gonna get a quality production.
gotcha.
I think what the plant produces, in my opinion, is based off the genetic makeup of the plant and not as much about how you manipulate the plant.
Well, cause like, one of the forms of THC that I've read about is THCA, and it's oxidized, which leads me to believe that it's been sitting out for a while. That's the stuff that's sitting at the bottom of my grinder, you know, that's just been sitting there for 6 months, because it's had so much time for oxygen to enrich it. So, I think it may have something to do with it, but it's like on a really weird chemical level, like
Well,
slightly altering things to their second nature.
When we process things in a lab, we change the molecular makeup of the plant. We separate things, we isolate things, and the diamonds are the perfect example of that. You know, the terp sauce that have the big chunky rocks,
Yeah.
those are THCA.
Okay.
And so that's where the THCA has been separated from the terpenes and from everything else that's already in there. So I think that would probably be the most common form of separation or altering something of the genetic makeup of the plant you're trying to
It's not-
separate.
Yeah, it's not the environment of growing it so much, it's just the genetics itself of the plant.
Yes, and so
Okay.
that's my take on it. Now, there's some people that know a whole lot more about cannabis than I do and have been in the lab for a while. Yeah, so,
I just didn't know if it affected the levels of it, like with all the other different cannabinoids, if their profile might slightly alter just because you started trimming a certain way, or like if you.
well, I think, again, if you stress a plant while it's flowering, and that plant has to heal itself, take care of itself, warm itself, hydrate itself, whatever it is, and that's the focus of the plant, that can lower the THC levels of the plant. It's not focused on its resin production, it's working on production, or healing itself, or taking care of itself in a different way. If you give a plant optimal conditions to grow in, it's not worried about healing itself of some disease or some other thing, and it can only focus its attention on the production of that resin.
That makes 100% sense.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So in my opinion, this is the easiest way and the quickest way to replicate a plant.
What about grafting?
Well, grafting, I don't see that much. Typically, I see somebody that has this one plant and they wanna get 700 cuts off of it. They want 700 clones off of this plant so we can put those plants into production. It's really difficult in a commercial scale to have 4 blueberries, 7 master cushes, 6 headbands, 3 Skittles, 2 strawberry fruits. You know, you really want a large number of one plant. And whenever we pack a pack, or when we pop a pack of seeds, we open up a pack of seeds, every seed that you get out of that pack will be a little bit different than the one next to it. And the best way to figure out the plant that you want would be to plant all those seeds and grow all those seeds from start to finish. Somewhere in between, you take a whole bunch of clones of these plants that you're about to put into performance to see if you want to keep that. And then you evaluate those and you say, you know what, I like this number 3, I like this number 10, number 6, 7, and 8 were males that are only going to destroy my garden, and then you've got that one plant. A clone of a clone of a clone of a clone, you're going to kind of move away from the original genetic makeup of that. But if you've got a clone of an original plant and you're taking clones off of this one, you're still going to have a pretty solid foundation for good genetics. So what we might do is we might take 2 clones from this plant, and then these 3 plants right here are what I'm using to produce 700 clones. You know?
So basically, you wanna try to keep the generations as close to the mother.
Exactly. Exactly. Okay. Yes, sir.
When you're taking a clone from a clone from a clone, you can get different phenols then still from the same genetics.
I think you can see variations of it, and there's something that's called the genetic drift, and it's just, I think, that the farther away from the original source you get, variations of things start to happen. So you can see something, you're like, man, I've never seen that in the plant. And it's just, there's something going on a genetic level that's changing that you might take into consideration.
So as far as seed reproduction, I mean, I guess it's genetic drift because it's pollinated, so is that why, or is it speed of reproduction?
No, I think, again, what we're talking about is how much you're damaging this plant. How much its weaknesses, its defenses have gone down. How much stress you put on the plant, different things like that. And I think that takes it away from its original state, over time. And it's a good amount of stress and whatnot. Now, again, if I put this plant into flower and then I disrupt its light cycle and I make it hermaphrodite, which can happen, you change the genetic makeup of the plant. The seeds that you get off of that will be more prone, if you can even get those into a plant, will be more prone to hermaphrodite in the future. So those stresses, those variables that we put on that plant can kind of change those things.
And does that just make it like less predictable? I mean, are not some of those stresses like Darwinistic, like evolutionary, you know, who's to say that it's not making a stronger, better plant?
And I think that's the road that we're on right now is still a deeper understanding of the plant. There are benefits to having a plant that doesn't produce on itself. I know that every time I put that plant into a room, it's always gonna do the exact same thing. If I've got a plant that's prone to hermaphroditing, and I'm planning financially on a room that's gonna give me a whole bunch of flowers back, and one plant in the middle of the room hermaphrodites and pollinates the rest of my plants, now I've got a room full of seeds, which takes the quality or the value of my product in half. So there are things that, yeah. Now, we'll get into it in a little bit as well. There's
I hate to
there's
say force genders, I would never think that you should, but
you can.
you can. Okay, so when you're clipping them, are you clipping their sex organs, or what are you doing to facilitate, hey, I need you to be a female because if you're a male, you're gonna pollinate the whole room?
Well, and I think the plants that are, and we'll repeat this here in a second, but the plants that produce females are basically genetically modified to produce just females. Yeah, there's other plants that do different things. So give me a second and we'll get right back to that. Outside of cutting clones, one of the new ways that people are taking clones are obtaining cannabis clones as they're doing tissue cultures. Tissue cultures is basically is creating a new plant in a test tube. You need plants that are healthy, and it's a new thing right now. Yep.
I heard, I'm gonna call him Master Jordan. I heard him say that bugs or pests are the signs of were created by God to remove weaker genetic lines and basically isolate the strong ones. That's true.
I mean, I don't know what guys.
Well, I mean, I see you just talking about making them like what you just say, hesitant or something. So if bugs would already be removing naturally the ones who are weaker, and the ones who naturally get left with it, like if they were just in nature.
Well, I think that's where we're getting the term landrace strains from. There's lots of cannabis in the world still right now that has never been touched,
Yeah.
or we would like to think it's never been touched and it hasn't been modified, and that's the original origins of cannabis. And then there is all this new genetic crossing, just like Monsanto does with all of our corn and with all of our watermelons and everything else, that keep it, pest-free, fungus-free, bug-free, more resistant, bigger producing, and whatnot. So
it's ready to breed.
it is.
Is it that they're making them resistant where they won't grow, or they actually making it where it's genetically modified where they can spray herbicides on it where it won't kill it like it normally would?
I think it's right now what we're doing is both.
Okay.
We're breeding plants that we know have a resistance to a certain bug,
Yeah.
but might taste terrible, with something that is really prone to infection. But yeah, that tastes delicious.
Right, right.
So we're breeding those two together and hoping that we can get that delicious taste with resistance. And then that's done with breeding, that's done with all kinds of stuff, yes, sir.
No, and that's, just opinion, that's where we start running into some questionable areas with this plant. Because these are natural processes that take place in our bodies when we're consuming a healthy plant. We start test tubing and GMO and stuff, that's eventually gonna have the same effect as our food has on people. So when we start talking about test tubing cannabis, I think we're going to a whole new field of it. I think we're kind of getting away from our because the demand is there, but that's the issue with commercialization. You know, is that the demand is there, but when we start getting GMO cannabis in Kroger and Walmart, it's not cannabis anymore.
Oh, they already sell that.
Yeah, but that's,
Hemp seed oil you can buy over the counter there, and they say it's derived from cannabis, not hemp, on the back, and it's disgusting.
that's what I'm saying. I think in that light, we're creating something different.
Well, I think the approach right now in tissue culture is a genuine approach. I think it's a legitimate idea, and basically the point with that is that all cells, or all plants have cells that can multiply and divide. And if we can put that in a perfect environment, and we can get those plants to divide their cells, and we can get those to multiply, basically we can get more clones or more production off of a small tissue sample. And the process to that is kind of beyond me. There's a whole group of people that are doing that, and I'm sure that there is even probably some home kits to tissue culture yourself at your house. You know, that's already got the gel and that's already got some of the setup, and you could do that. It's not a level of cloning that I do. I've heard about it, and I think it's really interesting.
It's like
But-
microcloning basically, so you take the little samples of it, and little tiny samples, and fill it into petri.
Yes, exactly.
How would you get it to actually turn into something? Like a whole wheat?
That's where I say it's kind of beyond me. I know the theory and the idea of it, and that is that you get a sample of it, which under a microscope everything has lots of atoms, lots of everything, and you get those cells to divide, and you get those cells to multiply, and you get those cells to grow. And then
Try to get a seed from it or something?
no, it actually will produce a root, it'll produce a stem, and then it'll produce a leaf, and it'll grow into a plant.
You gotta have those genes that is required to make that.
Well, and so getting into this, we're talking about just a lot of this right here, is that in this whole deal, you're playing with the original genome makeup of the plant. And the hope is, and what I've seen lots of people talking about with this, is that if you've got a plant that has been riddled with a pest, a spider mite, or even a fungus or something like that, that you're taking tissue culture is taking it back to the original genetic makeup of the plant, and we're starting to produce on that level. So if you've got a plant that's got these bug problems, as these tissue culture grow, you're not going to have those problems anymore. You're starting back from building block number one. Okay, so I think that's the pro. But again, once we start dividing cells in the test tube and multiplying cells, like you said, we're kind of playing with something here that, I'm not God, and everybody gets to make up their mind about. Yes, sir.
I worked at a stem cell lab, and we actually grew cells. We incubated them for 7 days. We derived certain cells that we wanted to grow different colonies of cells. Same difference. You just use the cells that you're looking for. Most of them already have genetic makeup inside of them already. And the same blood, we use hematopoietic blood, which is umbilical cord blood. We would take it, spit it down, pull off the supernatant, which was a concentration of the white cells. But those white cells are so premature, they can derive into any other colony of cells that was damaged or that you were looking for. So out of just those white cells, you have certain number of red cells that grow different colonies, mesenchymal stem cells. It's different ones that they're growing. They're growing their own. But
Depending on the body, right?
They're all in the same environment.
I mean, if you change the environment, that's what's gonna change the outcome.
No.
No?
Well, don't cells, aren't they, like I said, my theory is that they all have a cell wall, right?
Right.
So that leads me to believe that plants have in their cellular structure the ability to do everything. Their root system, their leaves, they can literally, any cell can be reprogrammed like a stem cell.
Right.
We differ from that because we have red blood cells, white blood cells, like you were saying, and whenever we have a stem cell, it has to be rerouted and redirected to one of our functions. If it's gonna be sent to something, then it has to be transformed literally from a stem cell into that. So what that stem cell's gonna do is it's gonna attach and bond to whatever is there and copy that. The cool thing about plants is that they're already, every cell that they have, it has everything they need in it. It's protected by a cell wall. So all of their genetic makeup is identical to each other. So theoretically, this is a really good method for that because, I mean, you can do anything. Like, it's not like you need a white blood cell or red blood cell. Any cell will do.
It's just be premature cells.
Yeah, they do. That's the point. Yeah.
Veering off the subject, so with feminized seeds, how are feminized seeds created to begin with, and then number two, do you take any of the stressors or genetic information that maybe you aren't gonna?
We'll definitely get into the different types of seeds here in a little bit, and I think that's all about really the genetic makeup of the plant is how you manipulate that. So this is, tissue culture is kind of the wave of the future, maybe not. So basically, stage one, you just want to take a tissue sample of the plant. You want to transfer it into a medium, which is a liquid or a gel. Then you're going to take that plant, put it in a petri dish or into a test tube. You're going to introduce it into a method which helps the cells divide and multiply. After they divide and multiply, they will start to form into a plant, and once that plant is large enough, it'll produce a stem, a root, and it'll start to produce its photosynthesis. Once that happens, you can take the plant and you can transfer that into a growing medium, and from there. So the thought is maybe that in the future, that is a cheaper way to replicate plants. Potentially you could yield more from one small tissue culture, you could yield more clones from one small sample. Yep, exactly. So this is a tissue cultured plant right here.
Do they usually take them off the mamas? Like a little small sample of it?
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
Does a tissue sample create more cuttings, or is it just one sample?
No, it'll produce, you can get a lot more cuttings off of one tissue sample. Can we look for that next presentation, that next slide real quick, please? So that's kind of what I've got for you guys on cloning and tissue culture. We're gonna move into the seeds and kind of some of the flowering stuff and the vegetative development, but before we move on to that, does anybody have any questions about maybe an idea that they'd like to clarify with cloning something or an environmental aspect, any of that? You guys good? Yeah, that's it. Just scroll with it? Okay. That's fine. So, cannabis has been cultivated for more than 10,000 years. We think it's been mostly done in China is where it started. We found some samples of hemp paper that date back to around 1000 BC. And hemp is pretty unique in the fact that it doesn't decompose really fast. So samples of hemp paper have been around for quite some time.
Declaration of Independence.
The first stages of crop development. Seeds. So seeds, cannabis seeds and hemp seeds are pretty small. They're typically a brown or a grayish color. They're tiger stripe. They're extremely small. From first glance, I don't think there's any way to determine whether a seed is male or female. Some people think that they've got some ideas, a soft spot on one side, or maybe the tiger stripes are a little bit broader, or brown seeds are males and gray seeds are females, and so, like, lots of ideas. I don't think so. Plant the seed and watch it happen and see what happens. So, cannabis is either cloned or started from a seed, and these are what your seeds look like. So feminized seeds are genetically modified seeds. They are seeds that will only produce a female plant. There are a couple of ways that you can get a plant to produce on itself. And one of them is a colloidal silver spray, I think is what that is. You spray that on the bud. The bud will produce a seed in itself, and that's just, there's something that's going on in that production, which I'm not a genetics guy, that, well, yeah, it ensures that the production is females only. You're not gonna get a male seed out of that. I've seen people get a lot of female seeds out of one bud.
By forcing the climate, they spray it on there?
Yep.
Most people will use it as mouthwash, that's funny.
Yeah.
I was just doing a comparison between people and it seems like, isn't it true that, well, have you heard that females, or every male was a female, we just turned into, I'm saying wrong, like, we're all born females, but then the males turned into during some process. Okay.
No, that makes sense. I mean, I've seen our plants.
Well, I mean, they can hermaphrodite too, that's a
Well, yes, they can.
characteristic, that's just really weird.
But another thing that's done to make feminized seeds is intersexual flower, which isn't quite a true hermaphrodite. It's actually got a pistil and a small stamen on it that produces like a tiny bit of pollen. And that's one way that I've read that feminized seeds are produced as well.
Isn't that a hermaphrodite? Because I've seen
It's a
buds.
slight difference.
Huh.
It's really, like, very slight difference from a true hermaphrodite.
Because I've seen that on a bud as a buddable hermaphrodite, and it does grow like a little banana in the middle of a bud, and
Yeah.
that's just enough to produce a little bit of pollen.
Well, I mean, I've seen them get ruined with those little dudes, but
Yeah.
I never checked to see if it ended up being all female seeds. It was just one.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, again, female seeds, I think the plus side to it is you're just sure that you're always gonna get a female plant out of it.
Most people dispose of males, right? You're supposed to.
Depends on what your purpose is, you know, breeding is a brand new business right now. There's a huge market for breeding, so the males become super important. Again, males hold that genetic makeup as well of your
So that's just.
And so if you wanna take that back later and put some of that male pollen on your female plant and keep that same genetic makeup, but maybe start over again, that's a really good way to do it. So natural seeds, regular seeds are the seeds that produce both male and female seeds in a pack. Female seeds are seeds that will only produce female flowers in the future. There is an autoflower. An autoflower is basically they produce a plant that will start to flower in 2 to 4 weeks. It really doesn't determine the light cycle. Generally, flowers start happening once you change the light cycle of a plant from a 6 hours of darkness to 12 hours of darkness. Autoflowers, they don't need that change in the sun to stimulate them to start flowering. So they're really good for places like Alaska. They have really long nights, in Canada as well, they've got really long nights, sometimes really long days. So the autoflowers are good for places like that. For somebody that doesn't really understand that life cycle, or that light cycle, it's kind of a good way as well. Autoflowers tend to be smaller plants, they don't produce as much, but there are some benefits to it, especially for people that live in different places. Germination is the process in which a seed becomes a plant. It's the beginning of a plant's life. Let me go down, sorry. Can't just answer that, can I? All right. Yeah, this one right here. Yep, we're gonna go through these probably kind of quick. So after a seed is introduced to its conducive environment, the seed will become a plant. It develops into a plant. Temperatures for germination are best at around 75 degrees. You get it lower than 75 degrees, it'll slow that whole process down.
So those seeds have a hard outer shell like a core on the outside, protects the inside.
Yep.
How long does it take once you plant it in soil in order to make it start germination?
Under ideal conditions, you're probably looking at about a week.
A week?
Yep. It's a little bit colder, might take a little bit longer. If it's too moist, might be a little bit longer. It might not even come out of the ground. But if you take and you get the right conditions, the right humidity in the soil, the right ambient temperature, the root zone is warm, you've got enough light, 7 to 10 days, you should start seeing something pop out of the ground.
But couldn't you shorten that period, the seed, the germination process by manipulating the seed, the outer core, soften the seed to make it germinate quicker? Once you
Well, so there are ways like putting a seed in a glass of water, letting it sit in there for a little while, and it'll kick out a root, and then you can take that and you can plant that. There's also the method of like sticking it in a wet napkin and putting it in a bag. Now my deal with the wet napkin is you put it in a wet napkin, you go to open up that wet napkin and pull the seed off the napkin. Sometimes that root is tangled up in that wet napkin and you can damage your root, your beginning root. The water, it works as well. But if it's done right and you have a small soil cup, you put a little hole in the top of that soil and you drop that seed in there under the right conditions, you're gonna get a plant in just the same amount of time as if you would have stuck it in the glass, waited for that to kick out, and then you stuck it in there.
how deep the cell does it have to be? Does that make any difference?
Yeah, you probably, your thumb would be a good measurement, not deeper than the first knuckle of your thumb down into the soil. You don't want to, after you create a little hole when you drop your seed down in there, you don't want to pack the soil over it as well. You just want to kind of cover it up so that light isn't penetrating down to that seed. But once it starts to do this number right here and start to shoot up, all it's got to do is push a little bit of dirt and boom, it's out into the sun. Make sense? So yep, after a seed is produced, it will be able to grow into a plant. Temperatures best around 75 degrees. Germination on soil. The only time I really see hemp or plants planted in the soil like that is hemp. People go out into big areas, they plant lots of hemp, they go on about their life. I think the cannabis, because it has the ability to grow the male and females and really deteriorate the potency of cannabis if males and females are together. We don't plant seeds directly in soil in cannabis cultivation, but it is done in hemp cultivation.
I bet if you just did that, if you just went out and tossed a bunch of seeds in the field, would they just cross-pollinate and would go crazy?
Yeah, it'd be like the weed from the 90s, the early 90s, where you got a bag.
Oh, my grandpa's stuff.
Yeah, full of seeds. No, there we go.
You can't, I put them in my smoothies every morning, every protein, man.
So in this stage of the plant's life, what the plant is mostly eating is consuming is mostly nitrogen. It has a really heavy nitrogen diet. Plants grow in a vegetative stage from the time that they're germinating until the time that they're going into flower. They grow best with at least 18 hours of daylight, 6 hours of darkness. There are some ways that you can differentiate that time schedule when you're a little bit bigger, but typically 18 hours of daylight, 6 hours of darkness is sufficient. Temperatures are best between 71 and 82 degrees. Whenever you're growing plants, germinating seeds indoors, you gotta always keep lots of circulation, and plants breathe CO2, not oxygen. So we gotta add some kind of a supplemental CO2 in there. And that could just be as easy as pulling fresh air in from outside, making sure that there's always some CO2 in the room. So indoor crops. Indoor crops, farmers control all the conditions. As opposed to outdoor, we get to control the type of light, we get to control the type of cooling, the type of humidity that we want in our rooms. We really get to control all the aspects of our crop. Outdoor crops in greenhouses that have some benefits to them, like they're, we lower our energy costs, we get to use sunlight, natural ventilation. They are more difficult to control, and when we change the photo period that signals flowering, there can be a little bit more variation there as well if you've got, different time schedules with the sun. I think in general, greenhouses are going to change the future of cannabis because it allows people to do things all year long, no matter where you're at. You get to use the best of all elements. But if you plant something outdoor, the downside to that is it can take up to a year to finish one crop. And with indoor, it can take about half that time. Factors that we control: the lights. Again, we're running 18 hours of light for a vegetative growth, 12 hours of darkness for flowering. We're always controlling that now. Sometimes in later stages of vegetative growth, we can turn those lights on for 24 hours a day, get a couple of extra hours of growth out of a plant. I'm a believer that plants like to rest just like we like to rest, and that extra 6 hours of electrical cost over the period of a month makes a huge difference on your wall. So some people will say, man, once you get into that vegetative stage, just leave the lights on 24 hours, but there are some things to control. So we do get to control it that way. Nutrients is another aspect that we get to control. Plants definitely need a balanced diet. They need nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, and calcium, just as an example of some of the things that they really need. Deficiencies can cause defects. You can get yellowing in the leaves, yellowing in the stalks. You can get slower growth. The leaves will tend to curl up, like these serrated edges right here on the plant. They kind of canoe. Sometimes these tips of the leaves will curl under as you get different deficiencies. So if you start to see some discoloration or your plant acting kind of funny, you might think about what you're giving it. Some things can happen.
So if you're growing it in soil, then could you do a soil, you have to do a soil sample test, right?
Yeah, so ideally, if you're gonna grow in the soil, you wanna test the soil before you put anything in it. Once you get an idea of what you've got inside of the soil, you want to look for deficiencies in the soil and add those deficiencies. As you feed a plant throughout its life cycle, it's gonna change the soil makeup around it. And so after it's done, you might wanna have to come back and adjust that again. Typically, whenever we're planting in a pot, we know that this is void of anything and everything, and we need to add a full, complete, balanced diet into that pot to make sure the plant has everything that it needs and certain things in different levels.
Would it stress it out, it means to move it from one pot to a new set of soil? You know what I mean, like if you know.
You could, I mean, if you're giving it nutrients day to day, and then you take that plant, pull it out of its pot, stick it in the ground, and then you never add anything, or you don't know the condition of your soil, you can run into deficiencies that way.
Yeah, I mean, like, just say like you got a plant in a pot, that the leaves started turning color, and it's loaded nitrogen, but that soil was being depleted of nitrogen, that you decided to do like a transplant from one pot to a bigger pot with new soil.
That, just because you transplant it into a new pot doesn't necessarily mean that that soil has loads of nitrogen.
But if you
There
know
are,
it does.
well, if you know it does, yes.
I mean,
Plants,
does it stretch
plants
it out
can,
too much?
no.
Okay.
Plants can recover from a nitrogen deficiency really easily. Nitrogen has a really long afterlife in a plant, and as we start to change our photoperiods and the plants move into a flowering stage, it really takes quite a while for the excess nitrogen to work its way out of the plant. So a little bit of nitrogen goes a long way with a plant. There are soils that are built to be void and null of any kind of nutrient in them. So transferring a deficient plant into a soil that is void of other nutrients isn't gonna help the plant. But there are other soils, like super soils, that are built, that are loaded with everything a plant needs to get it through its life cycle. That's what the bag says. If you leave a plant in a pot for a year and you're not adding anything, obviously the plant's gonna deplete what's in there. So through time, they'll use up what's in that. But if you were to take a deficient plant and repot it into a new pot that has stuff in it, yes, it'll recover from that pretty well. That makes sense? Okay. Humidity is something to consider. Humidity is the reference, and being in Texas, I know you guys know this, but it's the reference of how much water vapor is in the air, usually expressed in a percentage. A low number means a dry atmosphere, a high number means a wet atmosphere. A dry atmosphere can dry out plants and cause tissue damage. And a humid atmosphere can be conducive to fungus or molds.
So maybe have like a dehumidifier and then like spray.
I got a buddy that, it's, every place is different. I got a buddy that's in New Jersey that was calling me just the other day, and he was like, bro, I can't get my humidity up above 30% humidity, what am I doing? And, you know, then in places like here, I can imagine people are like, man, we're 90% humidity all the time, what am I doing? So it really depends on the area that you're at. Plants will grow between 40 and 80% humidity really well, but we found that over 60% humidity, you're creating that perfect environment for fungal growth. So 40 to 60 is kind of that target range. Humidity thermometer in your room, as well as like a regular thermometer, that'll tell you your temperature is a really good idea. Just always be watching those things. Again, if you're in an area where you've got lots of humidity, keep your air circulation up. A dehumidifier in your room. If you're living in a really dry spot, add something in there that'll give it a little bit more humidity, and it'll be great. Temperatures for plants. Biochemical functions in plants are necessary for the growth and survival, and that depends on the temperature. Each plant has an optimal range. This can increase or decrease the speed of photosynthesis, the uptake of CO2, water, and nutrients. So in a really cold environment, your plant's gonna work slower. In a really warm environment, your plant's gonna work a whole lot faster. The water that you give its pot is not gonna stay in there as long at a warmer temperature than at a colder temperature. Plants will grow in some pretty extreme temperatures, but they definitely perform at an optimal range, which is closer to 75 degrees. Ventilation is huge. Although small plants can't take lots of ventilation, especially those little baby seedlings. So you want to kind of work your way into it, and as the plants increase in size, you can increase circulation. This will prevent humidity, pest, fungus, and also lots of ventilation and plant movement will increase the strength of the plant. The plant will start to add more bark around its stalk to hold it up and not let it sway as much. It increases the strength a lot as well. Water is the essential building block of all life, so we have to have water to grow cannabis. There is a recommended pH, and it's kind of weird but it's neat. 85 to 90% of the water, or the weight of a plant, is made up in water throughout the growth. As you harvest a plant, hang it upside down, let it dry out. You can weigh that plant, it'll be 10 pounds. Whenever it's totally dry and you've got just that plant material, you might have 1 pound, 2 pounds of cannabis. People are always like, man, what'd you do to my weed? Nothing in it. Try it out. Yeah, try it out. So it's it can be really deceiving as you have a harvest and you're looking at scales and you've got massive weights and then they dry out and you're at 80%.
Before and after.
I mean, you have to weigh it before and after, but I personally like to just see the final weight. Don't get my hopes up. You know, that 80% cut and weight.
That's gotta be nice, like the bud tender for like the first time he walks in, he's like, yeah, there's supposed to be 10 pounds here, what's going on? He's like, I don't know, man.
Yeah.
I've seen some, outdoor drying facilities, where they hang it upside down and a huge thing. Is it any kind of like pest or anything that get on the bud while it's drying out that you have to look more to, or is?
I don't think you're gonna be exposed to anything new that you wouldn't have been exposed to during the life of the plant. You should definitely have a clean drying environment, curing environment, just to prevent anything else. But typically, we're removing all the moisture from the plant, so you're not gonna have a threat of new mold issues popping up. You're actually,
Insects, because you know some bugs gravitate to the plants that's,
yeah.
give off a gas.
So as a plant dries out and it starts to get rid of all of its chlorophyll and everything that is so enticing to those plants, as they get drier, the bugs will leave. I mean, bugs will still be, if you've got a bug problem and you harvest and you let them dry, you'll still have bugs on the plant, but I don't think you're gonna get a new attraction. It's really interesting as well, because when we hang those plants upside down, and you've got lots of spider mites, you'll start to see spider mites move to the top of the stalk and sit up high away from the drying material. It's kind of gross, but it's kind of cool. We don't want to see those bugs on our plants, but they will migrate to the top of the plant and they'll sit up there. Yeah.
So what's the?
Well, ladybugs are they sound great, but they're really hard to keep in a room for a long time. And you can put thousands of them in there, and they're just like, they're maintenance. They're not gonna fight off.
Not to come
disease
first
and
place, you know.
Tell you that product.
Is there an easier bud?
Don't ask. I ask.
It depends on the level of your infestation. There's some
Too shy,
squishy
too
mites,
shy.
there's some other mites, the predatorial
Too
mites
shy to ask.
that you can add into your garden. And those things will fight off problems in a major way, but as the food supply diminishes, so will your predatorial mites.
The back
You
seat
gotta
is
kinda
not
keep
counted.
adding them in there. There's some really cool stuff, for sure.
Just adding you,
What's that,
also,
okay?
your curing and stuff, you gotta make sure these mites are.
Yeah, so ideally you wanna,
Is there a way like if I'm or something?
no, it's basically what's on the plant as it's dried stays on the plant and goes with it in the bag. So you really wanna be sure if you're getting quality product. You know where you're getting it from, pest free and stuff like that. Yeah, exactly, yeah, get rid of the mites beforehand. And that's the true dream and the hope, is that you get rid of all your bug problems before you put a plant into flowering. You've got that plant managed, you've got a really good protocol on how to keep your area clean, and then you should not see a problem, an outbreak through flowering. So, after water, atmosphere, we start to pre-flower. Pre-flowering is that stage where vegetative growth we've decided is done, and this plant is going to start producing a flower or a pollen. Male flowers will produce little balls in these nodal sections right here, and female plants will produce these little hairs. Typically, about 6 to 8 weeks into a plant's life, you can start to see signs of sex. Sometimes it takes a little bit more and sometimes a little bit less. Some plants, it can be really hard to get those to show signs of sex, which can be one of those characteristics of what you're breeding for. Something that will start to flower really quickly, or
At what stage do you remove the males from the females?
I typically want to separate the males from the females as soon as possible. Sometimes it's into flowering before I recognize, man, I missed the smell. So I don't think you've got anything to worry about. Logically, until about the 4th week of flower development. Any sooner than that, there's not really enough going on to where you're gonna pollinate a flower. But still, I like to get them out of there as quickly as possible and just tighten up. But really where you'll see the female plants accept the male pollen is around week 4. So as long as you haven't gotten that far into it, you'll be good. Male pre-flowers produce balls, female flowers will produce little hairs. And then after that, we get into full-blown flowering stage. And the flowering stage of the plant is where all of this development happens, where we get the usable buds and the material that we want for an end product. Sometimes people, again, going back to the cloning stage and the whole breeding side of this, we want to postpone this as long as possible until we've got all of our clones that we need for future production, that we got everything we need to maintain this plant before we put it into flowering. Because once it starts flowering, you're going to degrade the quality of your clones. They'll be stressed out. You're going to stress out this main plant. So plants require a change in atmospheric conditions, either natural or artificial, to induce flowering. Changes from 18 or 24 hours of light to 12 hours of darkness per day is super important. An indication of flowers shows with the hair or its bud development. The increase in the size and the weight of the flowers depends on the nutrients that you're giving it, the lights, the soil, and moisture. Okay. Light during flowering, we control the light in warehouses and in greenhouses to induce or restrict flowering times. Basically, in flowering times, what you're trying to do is replicate the autumn days when you're starting to get less and less sun. Most common is 12 hours of darkness for a flowering facility. Some people vary that a little bit. They'll do 13 hours of darkness and 11 hours a day. There's some different numbers that people play with, but 12 is the typical standard, and it's a safe bet, so I'd recommend starting out to stick with that. If you're using autoflowers, if we're using autoflower seeds, those autoflower seeds will start to show signs of sex, even if you haven't switched your lights to a 12-12 cycle. So if you're using autoflower seeds, once you start to see the signs of sex, it's best to change the photo period of the plant. So switch it from its 18 hours to 12 hours. Although it can flower and develop better buds in darkness, it will start to flower, even if it doesn't have that 12 hours. So just make sure you can go there as quickly as possible. Photo periods according to strains. Some people say that strains that grow in the north need less darkness. Plants that grow in the south need more darkness. Some people say that the northern plants need a longer flower, or that start to flower faster, and shorter vegetative periods can take longer to start flowering. That doesn't make sense. Scroll up one for that. So again, northern plants, it's thought that they will flower faster, and southern plants will take several weeks before they start flowering. I haven't seen regional classified strains, so I don't know if my Skittles is from a northern cross or a southern cross. Typically, once I start to flip those plants.
Southern
And-
being like the equatorial
Yeah.
strain?
Yeah. So typically, I start to flip a plant in 2 weeks, I'm starting to see signs of sex. I don't really see longer periods of development or less periods of development, I guess. I do have a couple of strains that finish flowering in shorter days as opposed to 70 days. They might take 50 days to finish flowering. But typically, I start to see the development of the flower in roughly the same amount of time. About 2 weeks, you really start to see that stack on. Climate for flowering. If neglected, several problems can occur. High humidity promotes pest and fungus. Vegetative growth likes more humidity and warmer temperatures. Flowering likes lower temperatures and less humidity. Types of flowers, female flowers. Female flowers have the hairs like we talked about. They're grown for medicinal purposes. They provide dense buds, and this is the area where cannabinoids and THC is produced. Seedless flowers. This happens whenever you have a female plant that never comes in contact with a male plant. If a female plant is isolated for its entirety of its life, it will only produce a flower. It will not produce a seed, unless it's stressed. Okay? Male plants, on the other hand, they grow these pollen sacs instead of buds. There's no THC produced on these plants at all, and they just hold that pollen. And that pollen allows us to preserve the genetics and cross those genetics and spread those genetics throughout our garden.
Are you allowed to, or can you like extract the pollen and then keep it for a long time and then use it again later on?
Absolutely, it's one of the secrets in gardening is, again, a lot of people want to take their males and just throw them away because they can potentially pollinate the females. But an experienced gardener will take this plant, let it go its full life, develop as much pollen as possible. They put it on a bang table, bang off the pollen off the plant, they collect that, they put it in an area where they can dry the pollen, and then you can store that pollen, and later on down the line, if you've got a wonderful female that you like, either from the same genetic line or from some other variation that you like, you can take a small little paintbrush, dip it in your powdery pollen, and go paint it on the bottom of one of your buds, and that bud will produce a seed. Either it'll be in the same genetic line, or it'll be the cross of the two plants that you brought together.
Are there any medicinal benefits for male flowers? You can use them for agricultural means, they're not big enough theoretically, like to count cans, I guess.
Yep. Somebody else have a question in the back?
Yeah, I was just confirming what you said. You said so there's absolutely no THC in the male plants.
No, sir.
Okay.
So the only thing we're getting out of the male plants is the pollen. Yep.
If you put the pollen on one bud, it won't, seed the whole plant?
No, it won't. So if you take one of those little baby buds on the bottom of the plant, one of those little popcorn nugs, and you paint that, that bud will produce seeds, but the rest of the plant stays good. Yep. Hermaphrodited plants, as we've talked about, are plants that have been stressed out. The levels of THC in the bud is going to go down because, again, the plant is trying to do something. It's basically trying to reproduce within itself and save itself. See these little, it's not a great picture of them, but these are the bananas that start to grow inside of the plant, and that's where the pollen is produced. So again, this will make this plant start to produce seeds inside of itself. And it's, again, it's just trying to reproduce itself so that as it dies off, there's another generation to come. Timelines for flowering. I think each plant is different, and notes should be taken as you grow out different plants. Just to take note of how long a plant takes to fully develop, how quickly it does, and some of the, the different characteristics of its life cycle. Once you've grown a specific plant for X amount of time and you're sure of that, you've got your notes about it, you can pretty well be sure that all the rest of the plants that come after that are gonna do or perform the same way. Typically on the back of a package of seeds, it'll say this plant will finish flowering in 65 to 75 days. Kind of a general timeline. I've seen plants go beyond that, under that, but the best way to know for sure is run that plant, take some notes, and really observe it. So whenever you start flowering in week 1, plants are still stretching. They're still growing. The space between nodes are still pretty long, depending on what you're feeding the plant. The plants, as I've said, have a bunch of nitrogen in it. They're trying to use up that nitrogen. Again, they still quite haven't realized that they're going into that flower mode. Week 2, you'll start to see some brand new pistils, some little white hairs that are starting to grow around the leaves and the nodes. And again, the plant's just going to continue to use up its extra nitrogen. This is also a really good time, if you haven't done so already, to switch up your nitrogen, switch up your feeding regimen for your plants, start getting rid of the extra nitrogen and giving it more phosphorus and potassium, things that are going to increase the flowering of the plant. Week 3, stretching is almost completely done. This is when you'll start to see the first development of a bud, what actually looks like a real bud. There's almost no smell in the plant at all. You definitely want to lower your humidity in this time right here, just to make sure that you don't get any fungus or stuff starting between the buds. Any plant that has some deficiencies in this stage of life is really going to show through more than you've ever seen it before. So week 4. Thank you. All right, so week 4, vegetative growth is completely stopped. The plant should stop stretching at this time. Sometimes in those first 2 to 3 weeks of a plant's life, or a flowering life, the plant might double in size in those first 2 weeks of flowering. After those first couple of weeks, that's totally going to stop, and the only thing the plant is going to do is focus on the development of this bud right here. If you don't have tremendous space between your buds, those plants will really start to pack on something nice and big and dense and fat. Wonderful.
So it's like a growth spurt, basically, right before?
Yep.
Okay.
In week 5, your buds are going to start to fatten up. Any buds that were missing before are going to start to appear and start to develop on the bottom of the plant. Collection of pollen is really starting to happen here. If there was accidentally a male in the room or some other farm blew some pollen from somewhere else, this is where that really wants that. The female plant, this is where it takes the pollen and does most of its work. And this is also where smell begins to develop as well. Week 6, 7, and 8, flowering gets into its advanced colors. The trichomes, this frost, will start to become more predominant. The trichomes themselves under a microscope will start to change colors from a clear gelatinous into more of an amber color. You're going to start to see different colors in your plants really pop out. And these long hairs kind of suck up into the bud. These long hairs are what collect lots of pollen, and as the bud grows bigger and these things start to pull in, we'll start to pull that pollen in. If there's no pollen, excellent, it just turns into all orange hairs, give it a beautiful look. This is plants grow in spring and summer. June 21st, days begin to shorten. Each cannabis variety is different, but generally plants start flowering in August in our part of the world. Don't interrupt the dark periods, you can create lots of rot. That's it. So, going back through the vegetative cycle of plants. What can I answer for you guys?
Are you gonna get that presentation?
Do we have it in a handout by chance?
You will get that presentation.
Okay. Did I go beyond?
No,
No, all right.
no, no.
You're internal.
All right.
So in a climate control environment, how many harvests do you actually achieve in a year?
It depends on the amount of rooms that you've got, and how those things are divided up. I mean, in theory, if you have a big room, no, I got some over here. Plant a couple of plants in a room, day one. Couple more plants in a room on day two. Couple more plants in a room on day three. You can go through and you can fill up this room infinitely. And it takes 60 days, roughly 60 to 75 days for a plant to finish. So you can almost get it to where you're cutting down a portion of the room almost daily. Just depending on how you're planting in there. Again, if you've got big rooms and you can go through there and you can put big rooms in to plant at the time. Once a month, you can harvest, every 15 days, every week. This really is all depending on how you want to set up your system. Clone plants, find that genetic keeper, make crosses, save your male pollen.
How do you find that keeper?
I look for a lot of things. As the plant is growing and it's going through its germination stage, I want to see which turns into a plant quickly. As the plant's growing, I'm looking for the size of the leaves. I'm looking for how explosive the growth is in that plant. As the plant goes through flower, I'm looking for which plant is the frostiest, which plant has the best aroma. After I'm done with it, I'm looking for which plant had the best flavor, which plant has the best colors. And on all of my plants, I've got them labeled. This is plant 1, this is plant 2, this is plant 3, this is plant 4, this is plant 5. So as I harvest my harvest, and I even, and I put them in their jars, I know that, what I'm smoking today is plant 3 of that Skittles. And you know what? Although it looks really good and it smells really good, it tastes like ash. It doesn't taste great. It doesn't have that fruity smell to it, or that fruity taste to it. So I'm gonna get rid of that one. Plant 5, on the other hand, didn't have all those colors. It didn't have that frost, but oh my gosh, that had the flavor. So I'm gonna use this plant right here in extraction. Because it doesn't look pretty, I don't need to sell the prettiness to somebody, I have to sell the flavor to somebody, so I'm gonna extract that. I'm gonna use that, that's gonna be my extraction plant. You know what? Plant 4 looked really good, smelled really good, tasted kinda good, but it was a really big producer, so that's gonna be my production plant right there. You know what I mean?
One fact I didn't hear you mention was the meditation you give. If it smells good, tastes good, look good, but doesn't give you the right.
Yeah.
Then
So, and again, all plants have different effects, and whatever your desired effect out of a plant is one of the biggest factors for breeding something.
What about curing? How,
I like to.
what's the perfect condition for curing, and what's too short, and how long can it go?
Curing. Curing is after your plants have been dried, completely dried, and you're trying to bring out the smell and the taste of the plant and get rid of any excess chlorophyll. So what we do is we put those plants in a mason jar. We put those in a dark area. The first day of curing, I'm gonna pull those jars out of my dark area and I'm gonna dump them out on the counter, dump them out on the table, let them air out, kind of ruffle them up for 15, 20, 30 minutes, let them get some good air, so if there is any moisture in there, It gives it a time to dissipate, and then I'm gonna take those buds and I'm gonna put them back in their jar, and I'm gonna screw that lid on, and I'm gonna stick them back in a dark area. I'll do that for 3 or 4 days, ruffle those plants up inside of that jar, and then after a couple of days of doing that, and then the next time I put them in the jar, I'm gonna let them sit in the jar for maybe 3 days. I'm not gonna let them, I'm not gonna take them out every day. And then after about a week of doing that, I'll let them sit in there in a sealed jar for maybe a week. And then every time I burp that jar, pop that lid, I'm gonna kind of stir them up as well. And so gradually you're extending the time that they sit in a jar with a closed lid. The threat to that is leaving moist plants in a jar with a closed lid on it. You could potentially get those to mold. So the more secure you are that you've gotten all the moisture out of your plants, and you can squeeze it and it can feel crunchy. You can squeeze it and you're like, man, this is dry, but you put it in one of those jars and you come back the next day, it's like grabbing a soggy smudge. So you'll be surprised with how much water comes back out of that. So there are plants that are cured for up to a year. I've read it in books, I've never seen anybody do it, I think it's crazy. In my opinion, the fresher the flower is, the closer it is to that original harvest, is when you're gonna get the most flavor, you're gonna get the best THC, you're gonna get the best taste. I just think as it sits, the longer it sits, the more it degrades. Again, some people age it like whiskey or wine. I like it when it's pretty good.
Great.
Yeah.
So do you guys hire like quality control? Who tests you on a daily basis? Because that means you'll be stoned every day.
Quality control in a facility happens pretty much every day, in every aspect of the garden. Our plants are gone through and meticulously looked through every single day for a bug or a pest problem by the growers. Once it leaves the grower's hands and it goes into a drying facility, you've got a whole different set of people that are going in there and they're checking that bud every day to see how dry it's getting. They're looking for that.
That's what I mean, the final product, somebody have to be.
So the smoker, the true quality control is the consumer once it gets to the store.
So
And
really, you
the
don't know what the
response.
you really don't know what the effect.
We can't consume any cannabis on the property.
Right.
Yeah, you got a parking lot that's across the street. And,
Did you fit this law? Hey, this is a good what is it called, spectrograph, or where they rate the levels of cannabinoids on it, there's a lot of testing that we do.
Since you put that picture up there, tell us what's wrong with that one.
I think this is a nitrogen deficient plant right here. And it's really yellow, it's starting to get brown spots on the leaves, it looks like a nitrogen deficient plant. If you really want to be a tester, go be a judge at High Times Cannabis Cup, or one of the dope cups. Those guys, they get lots of weed, and that's their job, is to sit and smoke it and taste it.
Does it pay?
I think there's the fringe benefits, the plus to it. Yes, sir.
You get a lot of free stuff. So when you're talking about curing, is there, whenever you're transporting, there's gonna be lots of crystals. Like you're just shaking it out, you're playing with it. Is there a preventative that you can do to not lose as much?
Don't touch it. Typically, as we harvest and we're trimming it, it's going into a big black bin. It's selling at Home Depot, a black bin with a yellow top on it, and there that thing sits until it's ready to be packaged. Or once it has been packaged, it goes back into one of those bins, and we're just not playing with weed a lot. We're not playing with it a whole lot. It sits in one of those things until it's ready to get to its place, and then it goes up on a shelf.
So even if it is sitting in something that's just covered in crystals anyway, it's a moot point, you know?
Yeah. So the less you bang it around and the less you mess with it, it'll hold up. Yeah, it'll keep its integrity. Well, guys, thanks for having me out again.
All right. Gave you a lot of information today, huh? Yeah, it's like, all these terms.
No problem.
Okay, so,
Thank you, buddy.
We have
Absolutely.
the marginal feedback form. This one, that we would love to